they read Walter Mercer's will on a gray Thursday in a lawyer's office that smelled of old paper and radiator heat. And when the reading was finished, the only thing anyone around the long table cared to talk about was the picture house. Everything else went by without comment. The narrow house on Sycamore Street, the modest insurance, the sedan Walt had been promising to trade in for years. Those things were sad and ordinary, and no one thought to quarrel over them. But the Rialto made the whole room go still, the way a room goes still when a card is turned that changes the game. Vivian sat at the foot of the table, with her hands folded over her pocketbook, a dignified, silver-haired woman in her late 70s, straight-backed in a burgundy wool coat, reading glasses on a chain at her collar. She could feel the others settling something about her before she had settled anything at all about herself. 2 of her late husband's cousins had driven in, and a niece she saw maybe twice a year, and her nephew Wade, and they had all arranged their faces into that soft, careful shape families put on when they have privately agreed that the grieving woman at the foot of the table will need to be handled. The Rialto, the lawyer said, in the flat voice lawyers keep for the parts that matter. The parcel at the corner of Main and 2nd, together with all structures and all contents standing upon it. He looked up over his glasses. That's the theater building and the land it sits on, Mrs. Mercer, the whole corner, and whatever is still inside. Vivian knew, more or less, what that was supposed to mean. She had not walked through its doors in a long time, but she remembered the Rialto the way you remember a relative you have quietly stopped visiting. It stood on the dead corner of a main street that the bypass and the shopping plaza out by the interchange had drained of life a generation ago, a tall brick picture palace from another age, marooned now among boarded and empty storefronts. Walt had kept it running long past the point where it made sense to a banker, running real film when every other house in the county had gone dark or gone digital, and then, in his final years, he had simply locked the doors, boarded the glass, and let it stand. To everyone in the family, it was a dead white elephant on the worst corner in town, a liability with a leaking roof and a tax bill. Her nephew said as much before they had even reached the sidewalk. It was her nephew Wade, a thick-set man in a zip-up fleece vest, phone never out of his hand, who caught her at the office door with the particular tenderness men use when they have already made up their minds about you. "Aunt Viv," he said, steering her slow toward the street with a hand hovering at her elbow. "I don't want you losing 1 hour of sleep over that place. It's a millstone. It's taxes and insurance and some vagrant, getting in there and falling through a rotten floor and you getting sued for everything you've got. Let me take it off your hands. I know a fella." "What fella?" Vivian said. "A developer. Real money. From the city. He takes these dead corners off people, clears the eyesore, pays cash, handles every scrap of the paperwork himself. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. You wouldn't even have to drive down there and look at it. I might want to look at it. There's nothing down there to look at but grief, Aunt Viv. Pigeons and mildew. Why would you do that to yourself?" He said it kindly. Everything Wade said, he said kindly. That was the thing about Wade. He was not a bad man, only a hurried and an easily bored one. And he had confused, the way such men do, the simple road with the right one. Vivian put on her reading glasses, then took them off again, a thing she did when she wanted a moment to herself in a room full of people. Walt had been in the ground 11 days, and already the family had a plan for the one thing he had poured his whole life into, and the plan was a set of keys handed to a stranger and a check folded into her palm. "I'll think about it," she said. Wade smiled the way you smile at somebody you have decided is muddled. "Sure you will. There's nothing really to think about, but you take all the time you need," which meant, she understood, that he had already arranged for there to be no time at all. The family closed around Wade's plan the way water closes over a dropped stone. The telephone rang, and rang. The cousins called to say how they worried about her, alone in that house with all that responsibility. The niece called to say the developer was a lovely man, very fair, and that Aunt Viv oughtn't feel a shred of guilt about letting go of a broken-down old building that was, when you got right down to it, only bricks. There was a great deal of talk about closure and about how Walt, bless him, would never have wanted her burdened. Vivian listened with the receiver held a little away from her ear, and she noticed a thing she found quietly interesting. Not one of the people telling her the Rialto was worthless had, in all these years, ever once actually gone inside it. She noticed a second thing, too. They were all in such a hurry. Grief has a shape, and the shape of it is slow, but there was nothing slow about the way her family wanted this thing settled and swept and done. It was to be finished this week, this month, before she grew attached. Before. And Vivian, who had buried her mother and a sister and now her husband, and who had learned that the only honest thing a person can do with grief is give it the time it asks for, began to wonder why everybody was in such a tearing rush to bury a thing already supposed to be dead. The developer did not wait for her to finish wondering. He telephoned twice, and then he was simply there, on her front step on a Monday morning, holding a slim leather folder and a paper cup of coffee he had brought her, unasked, from the drive-through out on the highway. This was the developer Curtis Lang, a trim man in a pressed slate sport coat, a heavy signet ring on his right hand, and he had a way of shaking your hand as though he were closing a door very softly so as not to wake anyone in the house. He was extremely kind. That was the first thing Vivian marked about him, and it was the very thing that set the fine hairs standing up on the back of her neck, because she had reached an age where kindness that shows up before it is asked for is a thing she had learned to count the change from. He sat at her kitchen table and told her he understood grief, that he had lost people of his own, that there was no hurry in the world, and in the same breath he laid a single sheet of paper on the oilcloth and slid it toward her with 2 fingers, the way a man slides a treat toward a strange dog he has not yet taken the measure of. "That's what I can do for the corner," he said. "Land, building, contents, all of it. As is, where is. You walk away free and clear. No inspection, no cleanup, no lying awake wondering whether that roof is going to come down on some trespasser and take your savings with it. I hand you a check, my people see to the rest, and by spring there's a clean, safe corner down there, instead of a hazard that keeps a widow up at night." Vivian looked at the number on the sheet. It was a small number. It was the kind of number a man offers for a thing he has decided is worthless, or, she thought, the kind he offers when he is betting hard that you have decided it is worthless, and is in a great hurry to close before you find out otherwise. Vivian had lived long enough to know that the surest way in the world to be robbed is to be robbed by a man who has first persuaded you that he is rescuing you. "That's for the dirt," she said. "You'd knock the building flat. It's a tired old fire trap on the deadest corner in a dying town," Lang said, gently, opening his hands. "The value's in the land, Mrs. Mercer, and I'll be honest, even that's thin down there. I'm being more than fair because I would rather see a widow get a clean start than watch her bleed herself white on taxes over a ruin. Most men in my business would just wait for the county to take it for back taxes and buy it off the courthouse steps for nothing. And there it was, folded neat into the middle of a compliment like a razor baked into an apple. The small threat, the tax sale, the picture of her losing the whole thing for nothing if she were foolish enough to wait." Vivian folded her hands on the oilcloth. "My husband kept books on that theater for 40 years, she said. "I believe I'd like to read them before I put my name to anything." For just a flicker, less than a second, so brief that she nearly argued herself out of having seen it, something moved behind Curtis Lang's kind gray eyes. It was not grief, and it was not patience. It was the flat, fast recalculation of a man who has just set his full weight on a stare he did not know was there. "Of course," he said, smooth as ever, the warmth rushing back into his face as fast as it had gone. "You read whatever you need to read. The offer holds through Friday week, though. My crew has a narrow window before they're committed to a job 2 counties over. And once they roll, I can't answer for what the number looks like when they circle back." Everything with these men had a window, Vivian thought. A deadline, a fella who was ready, a crew that was always about to roll. She saw him to the door and thanked him kindly, because her mother had raised her to be gracious even to men she intended to disappoint. Then she went back into the kitchen, picked up the paper cup of coffee he had brought her, still warm, and poured the whole of it slow down the sink and watched it go. And then she went to the closet and got out the good boots. She drove down to Main Street alone the next morning, against Wade's advice and against the weather, which had turned the sky the strange, bruised color of a plum pressed too hard on one side. Main Street was empty the whole slow length of it. She passed the corpses of stores that had died when the street died. A 5 and dime with its windows soaped white. A corner bank turned to a tax office turned to nothing. A hardware with a ghost of gold leaf lettering flaking off the glass. And then the Rialto rose up at the corner of Main and 2nd, exactly the way she remembered it, and nothing at all the way she remembered it. Both at once, the way a place always is when the one person who kept it alive has gone. It was a tall, proud brick front, from an age that built even its small-town amusements to last, with a deep recessed entrance floored in cracked terrazzo and a marquee thrusting out over the dark sidewalk on iron brackets, its letter slots empty and its bulb sockets blind. High up the face of the building, the vertical blade sign still climbed against the sky, spelling the theater's name down its length in dead bulbs, the paint gone from red to the memory of red. Plywood was screwed over the poster cases and the ticket booth glass. A hand-lettered board wired across the doors read closed in Walt's own square print, and beneath it, smaller, in that same careful hand, back shortly. He had lettered those 2 words the day he locked the place up, and he had meant them. And then, he had never once come back. Something about those 2 small, confident words, so sure of themselves and so wrong, put a hand around Vivian's heart and closed it. The key turned hard in the lock. Protesting, the door swung inward and swept a clean, pale fan through the dust on the terrazzo. And Vivian stepped into a lobby that time had simply set down, very gently, and then walked away from and forgotten. It was all still there. The concession counter with its cold glass and dark popcorn kettle, the mirror behind it silvered black with age. The ticket booth like a little glass chapel. A worn runner of carpet, its red roses faded to brown ghosts, leading in under an arch toward the shadowed doors of the auditorium. And when she pushed through the padded doors into the house itself, there they were in the dimness, the ranked seats sloping toward the stage in long curved rows, hundreds of them, the plush worn pale on every armrest by hands mostly gone now, and above them the great blank screen hanging in its dark proscenium, and over everything the huge held silence of a room built to be full and left, for years, entirely empty. And back in the little office off the lobby, on a shelf behind the manager's desk, there they were as well. The ledgers. Cloth-bound, spine after spine after spine, each one lettered on the end in Walt's square hand with a span of years. 40 years of a careful man's careful attention, lined up like the volumes of an encyclopedia in a library nobody but him had ever been let into. Vivian stood a long while and only looked at that shelf. Outside, the stormlight shifted behind the plywood, and a single blade of gold found a gap between 2 boards and came through and laid itself across the desk and along the spines of the ledgers, like a hand set gently on a shoulder. She was not a superstitious woman, and she did not imagine her husband was in the light. But she took the light for what it plainly was, which was permission, and she drew the manager's chair up to the desk, wiped the dust from the seat with her handkerchief, sat down, took down the very first ledger, opened it, and began to read. She had expected sorrow, and sorrow was in it, waiting on every page like a friend who has sat up all night. But what was mostly in the ledgers was order. Walt had a way of setting down a figure that was very nearly tender, small, upright, level, column beside column, day beneath day, 1 year following the last without a gap. Reels rented in, and the freight paid on them. The takings of 10,000 ordinary evenings, each one set down as though it mattered, because to Walt each one had. She read a whole year of it by the failing light, and had to grant that, on its face, it was exactly what every soul in the family said, the plain, decent record of a small business that had slowly and honestly stopped making money as the street it stood on stopped carrying anyone past its doors. Which was the very story Curtis Lang was counting, with his paper cup of coffee, on her believing all the way to the bottom of. But Vivian had run a household on Walt's earnings for 50 years, and she knew the true shape of their money the way she knew the shape of his hands, and somewhere in the later ledgers, a thing stopped sitting right with her. There were entries on the income side of the page too large and far too regular to have anything to do with dime tickets and candy. 4 times a year, in the same week each time, a figure came up in the receipts column with a small notation beside it in Walt's private shorthand, a few letters and an amount, and that figure had nothing to do with any picture house selling popcorn to empty rows. She ran her finger slow down 4 years of them. The amount never shifted by a penny. It arrived like clockwork, quarter upon quarter, long after the projector had gone cold for the last time. Money was coming into a theater that had been closed and boarded for years, and not one living member of the family had the faintest idea that $1 of it existed. She did not understand it yet, but she understood this much. Down in her bones, a man cannot be robbed of a thing he has hidden so long as nobody knows that he hid it, and Walt had hidden something. He had hidden it in plain sight, in a quiet column of small figures, trusting, with the whole of his careful heart, that the one single person on this earth who would ever love him enough to read all the way down to the bottom of the page was her. She was still bent over the book when a car door slammed out on the street. It was Gus. Gus, a stooped old projectionist in a threadbare cardigan and thick bifocals, fingers stained from decades of splicing film, stood in the open door with the stormlight behind him, and his cap already off and held to his chest, the way men of his generation take their hats off in church and before the newly bereaved. "Ms. Mercer," he said. "I saw a light. I sure never figured it would be you." He turned the cap slow in his stained hands. "I still walk down this way most evenings." Old habit. Walt would have the marquee lit by dark, and the first show up at 7, and I don't reckon my feet have got the news yet that he's gone. He looked up at the dead blank screen the way a man looks at something that has personally let him down. "I'm awful sorry, ma'am." He was the finest man I ever stood next to, and I've stood next to a few that thought a good deal more of themselves than he ever did of himself. Vivian made room, and Gus lowered himself into a chair, with the care of a man whose knees kept their own set of books, and for a while they only sat together in the dust and the failing light. And then, because grief loosens the tongue, and because it had been a long time since anybody had thought to ask him anything, Gus began to talk. And he told her things about the Rialto that Vivian, who had lived 50 years beside the man who ran it, had somehow never quite been told. He told her that in its day the Rialto had been the only picture house worth the gasoline for 40 hard miles, that folks used to drive in from 3 counties on a Saturday night, and that Walt had run true film, real reels, on the same 2 great projectors up in that booth, long after every other house in the state had torn its projectors out for scrap and gone to playing pictures off a hard drive in a closet. "There's men would have paid Walt cash on the barrelhead for those 2 machines alone," Gus said, "and he'd walk them up to the booth, Show them the machines humming sweet as the day they were created, and tell them no. Real polite. Gus smiled. Walt used to say a thing you can still run isn't junk, no matter what year the calendar claims it is. Then, Gus told her about the other book, not the money books, a different book, where Walt wrote down the name of every regular who came through the doors, where they were from, the pictures they never missed, the people they had loved and buried. He'd ask after your bad hip, Gus said, his voice gone rough, and a year on, he'd remember it was your right hip, because he'd written it down when my wife passed, and there wasn't a soul on this earth checked in on me that whole black first year. My own kin least of all. There wasn't a soul but Walt. He did it with a bag of popcorn pressed into my hands and a seat kept down front and my name set down in that book so he'd never forget the date she died. That's what this place was, Ms. Mercer. It wasn't a theater. It was the last lit room left on this whole dead street that knew your name and was glad you'd come. Vivian asked him, quietly, where that other book was kept. Gus didn't know. He kept it up in the booth, he said, or down in the vault under it. He padlocked the both of them, these last years. Nobody but Walt ever set foot up those booth stairs, not the last long while. Vivian had seen the door. At the top of a narrow stair off the back of the lobby, where a knob should have been there was instead a heavy steel hasp and a padlock, and over the hole of the door somebody, Walt, had screwed down a solid sheet of plywood, as though a padlock alone had not felt to him like quite enough. She had taken it for a storeroom, a place a man shuts the clutter he can't bring himself to throw out. He boarded it clean over, she said. He did. Last year or two, that was. Got awful particular about it, near the end. Gus's wet eyes came up to hers. I asked him one time what he had up there worth all that plywood and bother, and he looked at me a long moment and he said, "Gus, I'm keeping it for Vivian. She'll know what to do with it when the time comes." The old man cleared his throat hard. I always took it he meant papers. Widow's papers. The dry, sad business of setting affairs in order. It never once crossed my mind to wonder what manner of thing it is that a man will board up a door to keep safe. Neither, until that moment, had Vivian. It took her the best part of a week to get up into that booth, and she did every bit of it herself. Alone. Because the moment she mentioned the boarded door to Wade over the telephone, he offered, far too fast, before she'd even got to the end of her sentence, to send Lang's crew down with a pry bar to clear all that mess out for you, Aunt Viv. Save your knees the stairs. That was the moment Vivian stopped telling Wade things. She said, mild as milk, that there was no hurry at all, and hung up and sat very still at her kitchen table a long time, turning that eagerness of his over in her mind like a stone she had picked up off the road and found, oddly, to be warm. She bought a pry bar of her own the next morning at the hardware 2 towns over and a good heavy flashlight, and drove down to Main Street each day through that same strange golden stormlight that had settled over the whole low end of the county like a breath held and not let go. And she worked at the plywood screw by screw, because her hands were not strong the way they had once been, but they were patient. And patience was the one coin Vivian had never run short of. The screws backed out slow, squealing in the old wood, each one a small argument won on points. She was in no hurry whatsoever. Hurry was the other people's disease. The padlock behind the plywood, in the end, she never had to force. Because she had already found it, the key, 3 ledgers deep, on one of her long nights at the manager's desk, tucked down into the gutter of the binding at the very place where the strange quarterly figures grew thickest. A small brass key, dulled soft with age, a scrap of paper looped to its head on a bit of grocer's string. And on the paper, in Walt's square and unmistakable hand, one word. Booth. He had left her the key in the same place he had left the answer to everything else, folded into the middle of the books, patient as the seats, waiting in the dark, biding all these years for the one person on earth who would love him enough and trust him far enough to read that deep. The key turned. The old hasp dropped open with a small sound like a sigh let go. Vivian set her shoulder to the door, and it gave, with a long, low groan of wood swollen tight in its frame. And the beam of her flashlight went out ahead of her, up the last steps into the black of a room no living person had walked into in years. And she stood on the threshold and did not, for a long moment, rightly understand what she was looking at. The booth was full. Not with junk, with care. The two great projectors stood square in the middle of the floor beneath dust sheets, and when she drew one back, the machine under it was not a ruin, but a thing kept, oiled, blacked, its lenses capped, ready, she'd have sworn, to throw a picture that very night if a hand it knew came and woke it. But it was the walls that stopped her breath. Along the whole of one side, wrapped every one in acid-free paper, and slid flat into a run of shallow wooden drawers, were the posters. Vivian eased open the topmost drawer with two hands that were not quite steady, and the flashlight lit up a sheet of paper as broad as a tabletop. The inks as deep and loud as the day they came off the press. A great picture show poster from an age gone by. Never folded, never taped, never pinned, its edges clean as the morning it was printed. Behind it lay another, and behind that another. Drawer under drawer under drawer. 100 of them. 200. Every sheet the studios had shipped him across 40 years to hang out front and then, by rights, throw away when the run was done. Walt had thrown none of them away. He had carried each one up here careful as a christening gown, and kept it. And there was more. Below, a second narrow stair went down out of the corner of the booth, and at the foot of it, behind a door faced in dull gray steel, was the vault, the old fireproof film vault the theater had been built with, back when the film itself would burn, cool and dry and dark as a cellar. And it was full. Film cans. The round flat steel cans, stacked in their tens and hundreds on iron shelves floor to ceiling, each labeled on its rim in Walt's square hand, the reels themselves, the actual prints, the ones a house was meant to ship back to the exchange when the booking was done, and that Walt, across a lifetime of quiet stubbornness, had never quite shipped back. Some of them, she would learn later, were the last prints of their kind left anywhere on Earth. Pictures the studios themselves had let crumble to red dust in their own vaults, saved here in the cool dark by a man everyone had agreed was running a hopeless business into the ground. And against the far wall, set apart inside a gray fireproof strongbox and wrapped within that in soft oilcloth, was a book, not a ledger, a thick, worn, hand-titled book, and on its cover, in the square print she would have known blind and in the dark, one single word. Regulars, Vivian sat down slow on the cold-bottomed step of the vault stair, the flashlight loose in her lap, throwing its long beam up the ranks of the film cans, with 40 years of her husband's patient, secret, faithful keeping stacked around her in the dark like a congregation waiting for the lights. And for the first time since that gray Thursday in the lawyer's office, she wept. Not out of grief, though grief was surely folded somewhere inside it. She wept out of the sudden, whole-body understanding of how nearly, and by how many well-meaning, hurried hands, this quiet, careful man and everything he had saved had come to being pried loose with a bar and hauled off to the dump by the ton. There was one thing more, and she did not find it in the dark. She found it 2 days on, in the daylight, when she had got the plywood off the tall lobby windows and let the gold storm light back into the house. And she stood at the front of the empty auditorium looking up at the great blank screen where it hung flat and gray across the whole of the old stage. Something in the last ledger had snagged in her mind. A line. Years back, in Walt's hand, screen hung a hand's breadth forward off the proscenium. Mind the paint. She climbed the little side stair up onto the stage now, took the flashlight, and went in behind the hanging screen into the dusty dark between it and the back wall. And there, where the modern screen had been hung out a foot and more to guard it, and had guarded it all these years from the light and the smoke and the eyes of a world that had stopped valuing such things, was the mural. It ran the whole width of the old proscenium and rose 2 stories into the dark above her flashlight's reach, a hand-painted mural of a kind no living hand in that county could have made any more. Figures in an old grand manner, moving through a painted country of hills and rivers and gold-lit clouds, the pigments deep and the gold leaf along its borders still catching her small light and throwing it back warm, whole and unbroken and clean, because a modern screen and one stubborn man had stood between it and the ruin of the years. Walt had not painted over it when the fashion turned, the way 100 other houses had. He had hung a screen in front of it, a foot clear, mined the paint, and left it in the dark, safe and waiting for somebody with the patience to look behind the obvious thing to the better thing it had all along been hiding. Here is the thing Vivian understood, standing in the dark behind the screen, that changed the shape of everything that came after. Curtis Lang had offered her scrap money for the corner, but no man who has truly satisfied himself that a place is worthless is ever in so tearing a hurry over it, nor half so relentlessly kind, nor a fraction so precise about a window closing on one particular Friday. A man does not race to save a widow from a building he genuinely believes is trash. A man races when he is afraid that she is going to go and look inside it first. She thought again about the small flicker behind Long's kind gray eyes the instant she had said the word books. She thought about how fast Wade, good, easily bored, well-meaning Wade, had leapt to send Long's own crew down to clear out the one room in the whole property that Walt had boarded shut with his own hands. And she understood, all at once, cold and entire, and without a shred of pleasure in it, that Curtis Lang already knew what was in this building. Not the particulars, maybe, but enough. Men in his line knew the old dead main streets the way undertakers know the old families. And they knew that a picture house man of Walt's stubborn, careful, sentimental habits, holding out alone on the deadest corner of a bypassed town, was exactly the kind who might well have quietly kept the very things the hurrying world was in far too much of a rush to hang on to. Lang had not come to her kitchen to clear away a hazard. He had come to buy a boarded-up treasure, sight unseen, for the price of the bricks and the dirt beneath them, and cart it off and sort it out quietly 2 counties over, before the grieving widow ever thought to wonder what her husband had spent the last careful years of his life climbing those stairs to protect. She was not angry, exactly. Anger is a younger person's fuel, and she had run on it long ago and knew to the penny what it costs you to burn. What she felt instead, standing in that painted dark, was the cold and clarifying settle of a woman who has just made out precisely where her own 2 feet are planted, and precisely who is standing across from her in the road. She let the screen fall gently back across the face of the mural, exactly as Walt had left it. She carried the fireproof box up out of the vault with both arms. She locked the booth behind her and put the small brass key on the chain at her collar, beside her reading glasses, where it was going to stay. And she drove home through the gold stormlight to finish reading the books, because she was not going to say one further word to Curtis Lang until she knew, down to the last quarter and the last penny, the true weight of exactly what she now held in her 2 hands. The books gave her the rest over the nights that followed, at her own kitchen table, with the good lamp pulled in close and the fireproof box open at her elbow. The strange quarterly payments, the ones too large and too regular ever to have been popcorn, she ran to ground at last on a page near the back of the newest ledger, where Walt had clipped, folded down small and gone soft along the crease, a carbon copy of a lease. Decades back, she read, in the very years when the bypass first opened and the life first began to go out of Main Street, An outdoor advertising company had wanted the tall, blank brick of the theater's high side wall, the whole windowless flank of it that could be read from clear out on the state road, to paint and light and let as a billboard. And Walt had leased it to them. And the lease, drawn up by the same plain country lawyer whose name was down at the foot of half the sound paper in the county, a man a great deal shrewder at his trade than his dusty little office ever let on, carried an escalator clause, and a term that renewed itself year upon year unless somebody should trouble to cancel it. And nobody ever had. And so it had simply gone on paying, quarter after quarter, year upon year, decade into decade. Long after every soul in town had forgotten there was money in that great painted wall at all, the rent came in on the dot, 4 times a year, into a separate account Walt had opened for that one purpose and then, in the way that was his to the bone, never touched. Not for the roof, not for the taxes, not once for himself. Vivian found the passbook clipped to the same page as the lease. She put on her reading glasses. She read the figure on the last line 3 times over, slow, to be sure her own eyes were not doing her a kindness. It was not a fortune of the sort that lands a body in the newspaper, but it was many times over the whole number Curtis Lang had slid across her oilcloth for the land and the building and the contents together, and it came in, faithful as a season, all on its own, 4 times a year, whether the Rialto ever sold one more ticket in this world or not. The corner Lang called worthless drew rent off its own high wall. The building he wanted flattened stood full of things collectors would cross the country to bid each other senseless over. And the reels and the register, the pictures no other house on earth still held, and a book with the name of every soul who had ever driven out of their way to love this place, were the one part that could never be scrapped, because they were the whole reason any of the rest had ever been worth $1 to anybody. Vivian closed the last ledger and laid her hand flat on the cover. She sat a long time in the lamplight, listening to the old house tick and settle. And then she made 2 telephone calls, and neither one was to Wade, and neither one was to Curtis Lang. The first call was to a house 3 states away that Gus, of all the people in the world, had put her onto. A firm that handled exactly the kind of thing that stood wrapped in acid-free paper in the drawers of that booth and stacked on the iron shelves of that vault. A woman there listened to Vivian's plain, careful account of what she had found, asked 3 quiet and very exact questions, and then went so still on the line that Vivian thought for a moment the call had dropped. Then the woman said, in a changed voice, that she would be on an airplane the following week, in person, and asked her please, in the meanwhile, on no account to let anybody move, or clean, or dust, or brighten up a single one of the items, not one, because with these things' condition was the entire ballgame, and one well-meaning soul with a rag and a spray bottle could turn a genuine fortune into a Tuesday's rubbish inside an afternoon. Vivian told her she understood about condition. She had lived 50 years beside a man who understood it better than anybody drawing breath, and who had wrapped every last sheet in that booth in acid-free paper to prove it. The second call was to that same plain country firm whose name stood at the bottom of the lease carbon, to make certain, in her own roundabout way, that the lease was current and in force, that the account and the balance in it were truly hers now, and that no one, she said the word plainly, no one, had made any inquiry about the Main Street corner or its records in recent months. The clerk set her on hold, and there was a long pause full of the far-off sound of a filing drawer rolling out, and then he came back and said, sounding a little puzzled, that as a matter of fact somebody had. A title search had been run on the property. Quiet, some weeks before Mr. Mercer had passed. Ordered by a company whose name meant nothing to the clerk, but which meant a very great deal to Vivian, because she had seen that precise name once before, printed small and gray at the bottom edge of the single sheet of paper that Curtis Lang had slid across her kitchen table with 2 fingers. He had looked into what he meant to buy long before he ever turned up on her step with coffee going cold in his hand. He had known the high wall was leased and paying, and shrewdly guessed near enough what was shut up in that booth and that vault. And he had sat at her table, looked her square in her grieving face, and called the whole of it a tired old fire trap on the deadest corner in a dying town. Vivian thanked the clerk very kindly for his trouble, set the telephone back in its cradle, and allowed herself, alone in her quiet kitchen, with the lamp burning low, one small, dry, and entirely unsentimental smile. Lang came back on the Friday his window was set to close, because men like Curtis Lang believe, down in the marrow of them, that a deadline is a kind of gravity that pulls on everybody in the world but themselves. He brought the slim leather folder, and a good pen, and the same softly closing handshake, and sat himself at her kitchen table as though the chair had been kept warm for him all its life. Wade came too, sent for by somebody in the family to help talk sense into his stubborn old aunt, and he stood off by the counter. Her nephew Wade, a thick-set man in a zip-up fleece vest, phone never out of his hand, looking as though he dearly wished himself anywhere else in the county, because some slow animal part of Wade had started, far too late, to feel the ground shifting under all their feet. Long slid the single sheet across the oilcloth toward her once again, with the same 2 fingers. "I held it open for you, just like I said," he said, the warmth rolling off him in waves. "Same number, even with my crew about to roll. I know it's a hard, emotional time, Mrs. Mercer, and I purely didn't want a deadline to cost you what's fair. What do you say we get you free of this whole sad burden today?" Vivian did not pick up the pen. Instead, without the least hurry, she laid down on the table between them, one beside the other, 3 things. The passbook, open to the last line, a photograph she had printed at the drugstore of one broad, deep, inked picture show poster lying flat and perfect in the light of an opened drawer, and the folded carbon of the lease, turned so the name of the title search company at its foot was facing him, right side up, where he could not help but read it. "Mr. Lang," she said, and her voice was as level and unhurried as her husband's columns of small upright figures. "You ran a title search on my husband's corner some weeks before ever he passed. So you knew the high wall was leased, and still paying, and paying well. And I do not believe a man goes to the trouble and cost of a title search on a worthless lot. I suspect you had a fair notion of what was shut up in that booth as well, or you'd never have been so quick, through my nephew there, to send your own crew to clear it out before ever I'd laid eyes on it." Wade, over by the counter, made a small sound and looked down at the floor. "You came into my kitchen, and you called a rent drawing, treasure-filled corner of my husband's whole life, a tired old fire trap on a dying street, and offered me scrap money for it, and brought me a cup of coffee while you did it. So I'd be sure to think of you kindly." She folded her hands on the oilcloth. "I do not believe you are a cruel man, Miss Lang. I believe you are a hurried one, which in my long experience is very nearly as costly, and a great deal more common. But I have had a great deal of practice, at my age, at being underestimated, and I have learned that it is about the most useful thing a woman can own, right up until the exact moment that it isn't." The kind look was clean gone out of Curtis Lang's face now. What stood behind it was only a trim man in a pressed slate sport coat, a heavy signet ring on his right hand, sitting at a stranger's kitchen table and doing hard sums behind his eyes, and plainly not caring for the totals that kept coming up. He did not bluster. Men as smooth as that almost never do. Blustering is for men who have not yet made their peace with having lost. He gathered up his folder and his good pen, stood and said, in a voice with every last drop of its warmth poured out, "You're making a serious mistake." A collection like that is a nightmare to sell. You'll have it around your neck for years. And a lease like that is nothing but a headache to manage. You'll wish you'd taken clean, simple money while it was sitting here in front of you. And Vivian said, pleasantly, that she supposed she very well might, someday, and that she'd take her chances all the same, and that he was welcome to see himself out the same way he'd let himself in. Which he did, without one more word. Wade had not managed to get out a single one of his own. He was staring down at the open passbook, the way a man stares at a train he has personally stood on the platform and waved off, watching it pull slow out of the station loaded to the roofline with gold. The specialist came, exactly as she had promised, and walked the booth and the vault slow, for the better part of a whole day in near total silence, easing each shallow drawer out and sliding it home the same careful way, lifting down one film can and reading its rim and setting it back exactly square. And when at last she was finished, she came and sat down heavily across the kitchen table from Vivian, and told her, carefully, in the low steadying voice honest professionals keep for news too large to blurt out, what the poster collection alone was likely to bring at a proper specialist sale, and what the vault of original prints might fetch on top of that, and then, almost as an afterthought, what an intact, original, hand-painted theater mural of that size and condition, thought lost with all the houses that had gone under, tended to do to the people whose business it was to care about such things. The numbers were not the kind Vivian ever once repeated aloud to another living soul, but they closed the subject of scrap forever, and they did not so much as take in the corner lot itself, because the corner was not for sale, not at any figure. On account of it had a great painted wall standing over it that mailed Vivian a check 4 times a year for the trouble of doing precisely nothing at all. But Vivian did not sell everything, and she did not simply pocket the money and drive away, because she had sat on the cold bottom step of that vault stair in the dark, and had understood, in that dark, exactly what her husband had truly left her. And it was not a lottery ticket. It was a choice. And the choice, she understood, was the legacy, the real one, the one Walt had trusted her, and only her, to be patient enough and stubborn enough to find, and then wise enough to make. So she sold the duplicates. She sold the posters that Walt, magpie that he had secretly been his whole life, had kept 2 and 3 deep, and the surplus prints of the common pictures, the ones any archive would be glad of but no one would ever weep over, and she stood quiet at the back of a bright, loud auction room 3 states from home and watched specialist collectors bid one another clear up into the rafters over the rarest of the sheets and the last of the prints. A lifetime of one quiet man's patient, secret, mocked at keeping turning, across a single afternoon, into more plain security than she and Walt had known, across 50 years of dime tickets and nickel popcorn. And then she took a good broad portion of it, enough to make the auctioneer smile and lift her plain country lawyer's eyebrows clean up to where his hair used to be, and turned straight back around and put it into the Rialto. She had the roof made sound, the water damage cut out, the plywood taken down off the doors and windows at last, the ticket booth glass reglazed so the low gold sun could come back into the lobby the way it used to. She had the marquee rebuilt and rewired, every empty socket filled, and the tall vertical blade sign restored by the one outfit the specialist trusted to lay a hand on it, and rehung straight and true. And one evening at dusk, with Gus stood beside her leaning on his cane, and what looked to be the better half of the town parked nose to tail down both sides of Main Street to see the thing done, she had a man throw the switch. And the name of the Rialto came up, all at once, out of 30 long years of pure and total darkness, up into the failing gold of the storm light, in a great blaze of warm bulbs, racing around the marquee and climbing the blade sign rung by rung to the very top, and it burned there steady and certain and sure against the bruised evening sky. And the old people stood along that dead street made a sound, all of them together, that was 1 part cheer and about 3 parts something older and deeper down than any cheer. A sound like people who have watched a thing they had privately long ago given up for dead draw a breath, and sit up, and open its eyes. She did not reopen it as the picture house it had been. Quite. And she did not turn it into a museum behind a rope. Quite. She did the third thing, the truer thing. She coaxed Gus out of his retirement and back up the booth stairs to the 2 great projectors he had tended the better part of his life, and she opened the Rialto 3 nights a week, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and ran reel film, the true reels turning in the true machines, the way it had been meant from the start to be done. She showed the old pictures, the good ones, the ones folks had first courted and first grieved and first laughed themselves foolish to inside that very room, charged a fair price at the door, sold popcorn hot from Walt's own kettle, and the light of the pictures moved and flickered once again across the faces turned up to it in the dark. She had the great screen rigged at the last to rise, slow, up into the flies at the end of every Sunday's final show, up and away off the face of the old proscenium, to show the town the hand-painted mural it had stood in front of for 30 forgetful years, lit soft and warm from the foot of the stage, the gold leaf catching the house lights and giving them back. She hung the best of the posters, framed along the lobby walls where the afternoon light could reach across, and set their deep old colors burning. And she kept the register, the regulars book, open on a wooden stand right by the door, and she took up a pen and began, in her own upright hand, to set new names down beneath the old. Because a place that knows your name has got to go right on learning names, or else it quietly dies all over again, and Vivian had not gone to all this trouble to let the Rialto die a second death. Gus had his own seat kept for him down front. Every single night the doors stood open, until the evening came at last when he no longer could. And on that evening, Vivian took down the pen and wrote the date of it into the book beneath his name, in her own hand, exactly the way Walt would have done. Wade drove down for the reopening. He stood at the very back of the crowd, sheepish, holding his phone in his fist but not once glancing down at it, and afterward he came up to his aunt and told her, with the clumsy gentleness of a man who has finally come to understand a thing at his own considerable expense, that he was sorry, that he had only ever meant to make it easy for her, that he truly hadn't known. And Vivian, who was not a cruel woman either, told him she believed every word of it. And she did, because it was the plain truth, and Wade had never once been anything worse than hurried. She told him that easy and right are not always the same road, and that they part company a good deal more often than folks care to admit, and that he was welcome at the Rialto any Friday, Saturday, or Sunday in the world that he cared to make the drive. And the popcorn, she added, was very good, which was about as near as Vivian ever let herself come to being made the last laugh, because she had learned, somewhere across all those long years of being quietly underestimated, that the sweetest and quietest vindication there is the kind you hand out warm, across a lit ticket window, to the very people who once stood in your kitchen and told you straight to your face to burn the whole thing to the ground. Curtis Lang she never once laid eyes on again. She heard, later, second-hand and third-hand the way a body hears things in a small county, that he had gone on and flattened 2 other old buildings further up that same dead street that very same year, and that where each had stood there was now only a flat rectangle of fresh gravel and a run of new chain-link fence and not one single thing in all that swept emptiness that had ever known a living soul's name. She did not gloat. Gloating, like anger, was a fuel she had long since given up as too dear to keep buying. She only thought, whenever she happened to drive past those 2 flat and nameless lots, of a vault standing full of film in the cool and the dark, and of a quiet, stubborn man who had been patient enough to keep the very things the whole hurrying world was in far too big a hurry to hang on to, and of a long, even column of small upright figures running steady down a page to a total that only a wife who had loved him enough to read all the way to the very bottom would ever, in this life, have found. On the nights when the Rialto was dark and the town had gone quiet, Vivian would sometimes drive down to Main Street all alone and let herself in with her own key, and sit a while in the hush of the empty house beneath the marquee burning soft outside, with the ledger stacked up on the seat beside her. And she would put on her reading glasses and run one finger slow-down waltz tender, upright columns, quarter after quarter, year after year, and understand it again, the whole of it, the way you understand a thing you already know by heart, but need, some nights, to hear said plainly out loud. He had not left her junk. He had left her a test, and a trust, and a message in the one language a careful, private, undemonstrative man like her husband had ever truly trusted with the whole of his heart, that he had known, all along, exactly what she was worth, even across all the long years when not one other soul had troubled to look, and that he had spent the last quiet seasons of his life climbing a narrow stair to board a door shut against the day the hurried people would surely come. So that the one patient person he had chosen, and counted on, and believed in past the very end of his own life, would have the time, and the proof, and the standing, to settle every last bit of it. At long last, entirely and only on her own terms. She closed the last ledger and rested her hand on the cover a moment. Outside, the stormlight held the old street gold for one moment longer, the way that it does, and then, gently, without any fuss at all, let it go.